Okay, so yeah, we're going to be looking at, just for people who just joined there, we're going to be looking at, this is the second of the talks. There'll be three more later on this week. And we're going to be kind of, last week, yesterday's talk was a very general introduction to some concepts of history and just the general sort of layout and geography of the region. This is kind of moving from the period of roughly the late Bronze Age to the time of the Judges, and then taking it down to the time of the king Ahab in Israel. So we'll the history that we'll be starting off with may be less familiar to people. There's kind of some reasons for that. But then towards the end of the talk, I think we should be into a little bit more familiar territory. So we'll get going. If my mouse will cooperate, which apparently it will not. There we go. Okay, so this is a map of the Middle East, roughly as it looks around the year maybe 1300 BC. So this shows some of the kingdoms and the empires and so on of this sort of time period. Some of them will be familiar to you, some of them will not. So we'll just kind of jump in and have a look at some of these. So the first and probably the most familiar, I think, will be the Kingdom of Egypt. This is Egypt during the New Kingdom period, and this is Egypt at its most powerful. Most of what you think of Egypt, apart from, say, the pyramids or maybe Cleopatra, most of what people would think of as Egypt is actually from this time period, from the New Kingdom period. I have a picture here of King Tutankhamun, and this is the burial death mask of King Tutankhamun. And the reason I've chosen this to illustrate the wealth and the culture of Egypt at this time is because Tutankhamun is actually quite insignificant. He is such an insignificant pharaoh that after he dies, he's actually forgotten about. He's not recorded in history. So this king is a king who is so, for want of a better term, useless, that he is completely forgotten by history. And yet the Egyptians are at this time so wealthy that they're able to bury a king's ransom in gold with this person. So this gives you an idea of just how much wealth and how much influence the Kingdom of Egypt had at this time. So if we go and have a look at the map. Sorry. Yeah. So you'll see that the Kingdom of Egypt controls not only the entire Nile Valley, but also western oases out in the Libyan desert, and also up the region of Canaan and along the Phoenician coast. And then in the region of kind of lower Syria, they are clashing with the Hittites before they eventually reach a peace treaty towards the end of this time period. So speaking of the Hittites, they would be another of the kingdoms around this time period. They're an Indo-European speaking nation. This is the lion gate of their capital of Katusha in central Turkey. And yeah, so these guys, they're great builders, but they're no match for the Egyptians. No one builds quite like the Egyptians. And but they have very impressive armies. They're able to fight the Egyptians, beat the Egyptians occasionally, but they ultimately reach peace treaties and stuff with the Egyptians and so on. So apologies, my screen is not following properly. Just bear with me a second. Okay, so this shows the kingdom of the Hittites. You can see their capital here of Hattushas. This is the heartland, and this area here is where they have client kingdoms, where these are allied kings that are kind of loosely part of the empire. So the next kingdom we're going to look at is Mycenae. And Mycenae is, it's basically Greece, and it's not mentioned in the Bible to our knowledge, at least not under any name that we can currently recognize, but they are part of the Bronze Age world. This is the golden death mask of one of their kings. If you're in Athens, it's worth having a look at. And yeah, just important to know that these guys are here. So there you can see the Kingdom of Mycenae. Next one we're going to look at is Babylon. So Babylonia at this time is ruled by a people called the Kassites. They are invaders who come in from the mountains to the east, and they basically Babylonia at this time, it's very wealthy, it's very influential culturally, but they're not able to control Assyria to the north, which is broken away from Babylon and is trying to forge its own great power status to the north. So here you can see Babylonia, and here you can see Assyria, which is broken away. And then to the east of Babylonia is the Kingdom of Elam. Now, Elam is, we don't know as much about Elam as we'd quite like. It is mentioned in the Bible. The Kingdom of Elam lasts for a very long time. It lasts from the time of Abraham down to Daniel. But it's quite far away from Israel, so it's only mentioned a few times in the Bible. It is mentioned, but not much. And we do have documents from it, but their language is not well understood. But on the other hand, they do have some nice little hedgehogs in the Louvre. So if you're bored of looking at the Mona Lisa, by all means, have a look at the Elamite hedgehogs. Yeah, so there is the Kingdom of Elam. This is their capital, Susa. So this is a picture of the world in the Middle East as it is around the year maybe 1300 BC. So why are we looking at this? And yeah, so it can be a little difficult to try and to sort of to match this picture in with the sort of the picture given to us by the Bible. But I think the reason for this is because all the historical sources that we have from this time period are from palaces. So basically, all the records are done by palace administrators. So if you'll bear with me a second and just sort of work with me through a not very clever analogy. Imagine the British Empire in the year 1800, okay? Now imagine that you have two people trying to describe it. You ask two people to describe their life for 1 week in the year 1800. One of those people is an imperial administrator in London, and the other is a fisherman in northern Canada, okay? Now, the imperial administrator in London is going to talk a lot about the British Empire. They're going to, they are going to be talking about fleets sailing to India, fighting Napoleon in France, sort of trade networks across to North America, etc., etc. The fisherman in northern Canada is mostly going to talk about fishing. So basically, even though he may be part of the British Empire, it isn't really part of his world. And I think that during the Bronze Age, at least for part of the Bronze Age, the Israelites are slaves in Egypt. So their perspective on the world is not going to be the same as the imperial administrators of Egypt or Babylon or the Hittites. So it's a case of the stuff that they will talk about is going to be very different from what the imperial records are going to talk about, and the imperial records probably will not mention them. Slaves were not of great interest to the pharaohs and the kings and the emperors and so on. And say even the events of Exodus, again, these are not things that would be talked about by the pharaohs because it's very embarrassing. Wandering in the Sinai, that would not be mentioned. It would just be outside of their interest. So it's quite difficult to go and try and find out exactly how sort of biblical history matches in with this picture. But I think it's really down to the different perspectives that they have. So say, for example, if we take that the analogy of the fisherman in northern Canada and the imperial administrator in London, if we went and sort of fast forwarded, gave those sort of two accounts to someone 3,000 years in the future, it's unlikely that person 3,000 years in the future would look at those two accounts and think that they were from the same time period, describing the same region. They would be so different sounding, even though both are actually part of the British Empire. So that kind of gives you an idea of how tricky it is to kind of go and sort of match in the two different pictures. It's not that one is right and the other is wrong. It's a case of they're describing different things, looking at different perspectives. So one of the reasons I kind of wanted to show this sort of interesting world of like these kings, they all write to each other, they have diplomacy, trade, and so on and so forth. One of the reasons I wanted to kind of show you this sort of world is because it all comes crashing down. So around the year 1200 BC. It's not the exact year is not really important, but it's in and around that time. The intricate world of the late Bronze Age collapses, and no one is exactly sure why. Now, we do have documents from this time. So some of them, I'm going to read out one or two of them. There's a lot of these, just to give you an idea of sort of just the confusion of this time period. So 20 enemy ships slipped away into the mountain region, and we don't know where they've gone. So this is from a city called Ugarit in northern Syria, and they're writing to a king in Cyprus. It's not clear if this letter was ever actually sent. And this is another letter from the same city. Since there is famine in your house, we will starve to death. The living soul of your country is no more. So this is a diplomat from Ugarit writing to the Hittite Empire. Ugarit is part of the Hittite Empire at the time. Meanwhile, in Egypt, this is an inscription from one of the pharaohs, Ramses III, and basically he's looking out and he's seeing civilization collapsing all around them. And as far as he can tell, what's happening is that these cities are being attacked by some peoples that they call the sea peoples. As for the countries who came from the land in isles in the midst of the sea, as they were coming forward towards Egypt, their hearts were lying on their hands, a net was prepared for them. So this is basically talking about how the Egyptians realize that everything is collapsing and try and basically stop it. And they are successful. They do save Egypt. Egypt is not destroyed, but they lose their empire. And yeah. So this is a picture of the sea peoples from that same inscription place. This is a temple called Medinet Habu in Egypt. And you can see here the sea peoples. These are captives. You can tell that their arms are bound. Now, we just don't know a whole pile about the sea peoples. The Egyptians don't really know much about them either. So we're kind of reliant on people who don't really know what's going on writing honestly. And even if the Egyptians are writing honestly, they may have simply misunderstood what was going on. We don't know much about the sea peoples, who they are, why they're doing what they're doing, where they come from, etc. But intriguingly, the one thing we are kind of sure of is that the Philistines have some connection with these guys. We're not sure exactly how they're connected, but the tribes that the Egyptians are talking about are very similar in name to the Hebrew word for the Philistines. Further inland, around Assyria, so this is an inscription of one of the Assyrian kings. The people ate one another's flesh to save their lives. Like a flood's ravaging water, the army and rulers became strong, plundered the crops of Assyria, conquered and took many fortified cities of Assyria. So further inland, they're not getting attacked by people from the sea, obviously because they're inland, but stuff seems to still break down. People come in from the desert and attack, and Assyria and Babylon are not destroyed, but they are kind of reduced to maybe a couple of cities. Assyria seems to only control 3 cities. Babylon maybe only controls 2. They're really, really reduced. So what happens after this? So let's go back to this map and look at kind of what survives. So almost nothing survives in Mycenae. They are devastated. Their civilization is wiped out, their cities are abandoned, and they forget how to write for the next 500 years. So that's an intense dark age. The Hittites their capital Hattusas is burned, and the whole center of their empires basically disappears. The kingdoms down here become independent, and some of them do carry on as Hittite kingdoms, but they're just tiny independent cities. We refer to these as the Neo-Hittite states. Egypt loses all of this territory here. They are reduced to just the Nile, and they become much weaker. Assyria is reduced to these 3 cities here. Babylon really only controls maybe Babylon and Nippur. And because Elam is always kind of the exception, Elam actually gets stronger. So just, someone has to, I guess. So one of the things that I want to kind of just point out is that the decline of the empires means that there's a power vacuum. Basically, all this entire region, which had been controlled by various empires, is now either independent city-states, desert tribesmen, or just anyone's game. So out of the ashes of an old world, a new world rises. So some of the consequences from this. I don't know if people are familiar with Greek literature, but the Iliad is almost certainly some sort of reflection of the chaos of these times. I was telling about how the Greeks forgot how to write for 500 years, but they do have poets who preserve memories of stuff that went before. And the poets have these sort of tales of a heroic age where people who dress up in bronze fight mighty wars against huge cities and so on. And these memories are probably some form of memory of the decline and the fall of the Bronze Age. So yeah, the earliest European literature is some reflection of the chaos this time. And yeah, so we talk of this as the Bronze Age, but bronze is an alloy. It relies on a fusion of copper and tin. Now, copper it's not very common, but it is, you can find it in the Middle East. Tin, though, is very rare. And to get tin, you have to rely on long distance trade networks. When the empires fall, the long distance trade networks dry up, and there is no more tin. No more tin, no more bronze, no more metal. So very quickly, faced with the possibility of not having any metal at all, people switched to iron. And iron was kind of known about during the Bronze Age, but it wasn't used. It was considered kind of a weird luxury metal. It requires much higher temperatures than bronze, but it's relatively common. So once the bronze supply dried up, or more specifically the tin supply, people very quickly switched over to iron. We refer to this as the early Iron Age. So basically switching from the late Bronze Age to the early Iron Age. The next thing, so we still actually use iron. Like you could talk about it still being in the Iron Age because it's still probably our primary metal. But the next thing that happens around this time period is something that I guarantee every one of us has actually used today. The alphabet. So when civilization kind of collapses, you're not able to go and do the same sort of, you can't have the advanced scribal classes that the large empires had had. So there was an incentive for people to try and find simpler ways of keeping records. So one of the ways that this was done was the Phoenicians adapt one of the Egyptian writing systems and turn it from a system of about maybe 500 characters down to a system of about 20 plus characters. And this alphabet that is used is very quickly adapted by the Hebrews who live nearby and by all the other peoples in the lands between the river and Egypt. And it's a phenomenal invention. It is the forerunner of pretty much every alphabet. Well, not every alphabet. Korean is not, but say Arabic, our own alphabet, the Greek alphabet, Cyrillic alphabet that the Russians use, some of the Indian alphabets are all based off of this writing system. It's something that it's an invention that has literally changed the world. If you look at this, you can actually see similarities to our own system. So rotate this B Beth symbol, and you will get something that looks not that dissimilar to our own B. Rotate this, and you start to see a D, and so on as well. Like a lot of the letters actually look not that too far away from our own. One thing you will notice is that it's missing a few letters, including vowels. It doesn't really have vowels. Vowels only really sort of show up about maybe 500 years later in Greece. So as a bit of an irony of history though, because this is a much simpler writing system and because it doesn't require writing on mud like the cuneiform had before, it's much more fragile. They write it on papyrus, and in the rainy climates, well, they're not very rainy, but they have some rain, climates of the Middle East, outside of Egypt, the papyrus that this was written on degrades. So it's an irony of history that the Phoenicians, the culture that invented this particular alphabet, that is the basis of most writing systems on Earth at the moment, have almost no literature preserved, because this phenomenal invention actually means that very little survives. So yeah, it's kind of a bit sadly ironic, unfortunately. Another thing to kind of note is that Egypt, which had before this had been extremely wealthy, extremely strong, Egypt is quite weak. This is the death mask of a pharaoh called Susenis I. And why is this death mask, which is also made of gold, why is this mask a sign of weakness when the death mask of Tutankhamun was a sign of strength? That's a good question. The reason for it is that this is not Susenis' death mask. We found the tomb of Susenis, and it was analyzed and excavated by archaeologists. And they went and when they analyzed the artifacts, they found that these had not been made at the time of Susenis. In fact, they'd been made for another pharaoh. Susenis wanted to be buried like a great pharaoh of the New Kingdom, but he hadn't the wealth to go and bury. So basically, the only way he could get the burial that he wanted was to loot the tombs of his ancestors. So when the pharaohs are reduced to grave robbing, that gives you an idea of just how far Egypt has fallen in terms of power and wealth. So we've kind of covered a fair amount of sort of stuff, and as I was saying, it's a little difficult to try and get an exact synchronism between biblical history and secular history at this point. But one thing that nearly all scholars are agreed on is that at least some of the period of the Book of Judges overlaps with the sort of the chaos following the decline of the Bronze Age. So basically that kind of takes us into kind of more familiar territory. Because I appreciate that not many people would be very familiar with kind of the late Bronze Age world. So we've covered quite a bit of ground. So does anyone have any questions?
Any questions?
You?
David, where I know it's a debatable one, but where would you or what date would you put the Exodus then? Since there is a bit of
There's two there are two dates that are normally given for it. One is, and I might be a little bit wrong here because I actually didn't look at this beforehand. One is about 1450, the other is about 1200. So some scholars basically sort of say there's not sufficient evidence for Israel there before the Bronze Age collapse. Others say there is some evidence that Israel was there before the Bronze Age collapse. Taking the biblical dates at face value, the date will be roughly about 1450, but some of the dates around there, historians have some sort of questions over whether we're interpreting the Bible correctly at that point. So you're looking sometime between 1450 and 1200 BC is the dates for the Exodus, give or take.
thanks.
All right. Okay, I'll head on. There will be other periods for questions as well, just, yeah. So now, as we were talking about how in the previous talk, about how the great river civilizations that they had much larger populations than the lands in between them. So if those river civilizations are strong, they tend to kind of dominate the lands in between. However, now these river civilizations are weak, and that gives the opportunity for the rise of Israel. So around maybe 1050 or so, the tribes, which during the time of Judges had been quite disunited, do begin to kind of unite. And so the tribes will actually fight each other a fair amount during the Book of Judges. You'll see it in the stories of Jephthah, in the stories of Gideon, and then the wars between the Benjamites and the other tribes. So here's one, the part of the story of Jephthah from Judges. Jephthah then called together the men of Gilead and fought against Ephraim. The Gileadites struck them down. The Gileadites captured the fords of the Jordan leading to Ephraim, and whenever a survivor of Ephraim said, "Let me cross over," the men of Gilead asked him, "Are you an Ephraimite?" If he replied, "No," they said, "All right, say Shibboleth." If he said Sibboleth, because he could not pronounce the word correctly, they seized him and killed him at the fords of the Jordan. So this shows that war between the tribes was not unheard of, and that they were capable of uniting against outside foes, but that they also would fight each other. This, basically, the first sort of king of Israel is King Saul, who is crowned by Samuel. Samuel is shown here. This is Saul clutching at the cloak of Samuel. And Saul he's just not able to, he unites Israel to a point. He has some successes. His dynasty does not last, and he struggles to deal with the Philistines, who control the coastal plains to the west of the Israelite hills. And this is a later picture of Saul and his son Jonathan dying at the Battle of Mount Gilboa against the Philistines. Just as a minor note, cavalry was not really widely used at this point. So this is actually an anachronistic picture, just in case you didn't get that. So after Saul comes King David. And King David unites Israel. He defeats the Philistines and the remaining Canaanite cities in Israel. He defeats the Aramean tribes to the north and to the west of Israel, and through alliances with Hamath, further north again, and Tyre along the coast. He's able to extend military influence all the way up to the Neo-Hittite states on the edges of the Euphrates. He probably doesn't have direct control. What it seems to be is more he's allied with the king of Hamath, and the king of Hamath pays him tribute and acknowledges him as overlord. But you're not looking at direct Israelite control of Hamath. So a lot of King David's reign is actually involved in fighting various wars, either internal rebellions or dealing with the previous dynasty or fighting the external enemies. His son, King Solomon, has much greater success in terms of just being able to sit back and smell the roses, as it were. David did a lot of work. Solomon enjoys a lot of the benefits thereof. Solomon profits from the trade routes. He has alliances with the Kingdom of Sheba, which is probably in present-day Yemen. He has alliances with Tyre, with Egypt, with Hamath, with all the other sort of states in the region. This is perhaps the height of Israelite influence. But we must note that neither David nor Solomon are documented externally. We shouldn't be too surprised about this because I was sort of saying that the other kingdoms at this point were actually in decline. So Egypt, Assyria, Babylonia are all very weak. So we don't have documents about David and Solomon because we have very few documents at all. We also don't see them much in the archaeological record. But again, this is not that unsurprising because David and Solomon both rule from Jerusalem, and Jerusalem is quite a difficult city to excavate because there is so much other stuff there. So this gives you an idea of some of the trading networks that Solomon was involved in. So this is from 1 Kings 10. Solomon's horses were imported from Egypt and from Cilicia. The royal merchants purchased them from Cilicia at the current price. They imported a chariot from Egypt for 600 shekels of silver and a horse for 150. They also exported them to all the kings of the Hittites and of the Arameans. So probably the most famous thing that Solomon does is he builds the temple. Now, we obviously aren't able to excavate this temple because it's pretty much sitting underneath the Dome of the Rock, and you can't just tear down the Dome of the Rock to excavate this. But it does conform to a standard building plan that was used in the region. So we have we have found other temples quite similar to this, but on a much smaller scale. So it was a very large temple of the type that was built in the region. Again, yeah, it's quite difficult to excavate this area. This is another artist's impression of what the temple looked like, and we get a real picture from here of just how phenomenal the interior of the temple must really have looked. There was a lot of gold, a lot of decoration. It must have been very beautiful. But one thing we should remember is that temples in the ancient world, regardless of culture, whether you're Egyptian, Assyrian, Hebrew, Greek, Roman, etc., temples are not for worship in the way that, say, churches or cathedrals are. Temples were for priests and the god. The congregation would gather in courtyards outside the temples. And you'll find that from reading the Bible, that the interior of the temple is really kind of priests only. So the kingdom itself does not last. It splits after Solomon, during the reign of Solomon's son, Rehoboam. So in and around the year 930 BC, we're not sure the exact year, the years kind of move slightly, but it's in and around 930 BC. David is from the tribe of Judah, and Solomon and Rehoboam are obviously from that tribe as well. And the northern tribes kind of feel a little bit hard done by that they're under the reign of Solomon, that they were treated harshly. And when Rehoboam basically kind of ignores them when they ask for stuff, well, he doesn't ignore them, he actually aggravates them. When he is quite insolent towards them, they rebel against him and appoint a person called Jeroboam as their king instead. So the kingdom splits. We refer to the northern kingdom as Israel and the southern kingdom as Judah. So in the northern kingdom, the Bible talks about how Jeroboam sets up golden calves at two sort of places, Dan and Bethel, I believe. And this is probably not a new worship of a new god. This is probably some form of sort of incorrect worship of the God of Israel, but just done in a very, very incorrect manner. It's basically to try and stop people going to the temple in Jerusalem. So you might ask, if there was a revolution like this, why didn't Rehoboam crush immediately the revolt of Jeroboam? Or if Jeroboam's kingdom was so much larger than the kingdom of Rehoboam, why didn't Jeroboam ultimately crush Rehoboam? And I think the answer for this is that there is external interference, that the kingdoms, that both north and south are hit by an external invasion. And I believe that it's now this is of course conjecture. This is my own sort of opinions based on what I've read. It is spoken of in the Bible, but this is like, we shouldn't confuse my own sort of speculation with certainties. So the Bible talks about an invasion by an Egyptian king called Shishak. There is an Egyptian pharaoh called Shoshenq. He's not actually Egyptian. He's a Libyan general who has taken over Egypt while Egypt is weak. And he basically decides to, for the first time in quite a long time, to launch an expedition outside of Egypt. And he attacks the lands of Canaan and he burns down a lot of cities. So you can see here, this is Shoshenq here. This is his inscription at a place called the Bubastai Portal. And here you can see the names of the places that he has attacked. And it's quite cleverly done. This is like, they have little pictures of people shaped like the people of the places he's attacking. And each of these people has within them a cartouche with the name of the city that he's attacked. So it's a clever enough sort of piece of royal propaganda. So we think that Shishak is the same person as Shoshenq, and that Shoshenq attacked Jerusalem. So here's the biblical reference. In the 5th year of King Rehoboam, Shishak, king of Egypt, attacked Jerusalem. He carried off the treasures of the temple of the Lord and the treasures of the royal palace. He took everything, including all the gold shields Solomon had made. So if we look here, you would imagine that this is, I mean, we have Shishak, we have Shoshenq, one attacks Canaan, the other attacks Jerusalem. I mean, this is so similar sounding, we can be almost positive that this is the same person, this is the guy. We can't say for sure though. We have maybe 95 to 99% certainty, but we don't have 100%. The reason is that the inscription is damaged and the word Jerusalem is not actually there. We're just not 100% sure that it is Jerusalem. So we're nearly 100% sure, but if I'm being 100% honest, I have to say there's the tiniest little bit of doubt. And just a very quick point, I don't know if any people are thinking of the Indiana Jones and the Raiders of the Lost Ark, but contrary to what Indiana Jones will tell you, we are confident that Shishak did not take the Ark of the Covenant. So there may yet be redemption for Shoshenq. Right. So this is it's an artifact. It's a little bit random. It's a little bit different from what we've been looking at so far. But this is the Gezer Calendar, and this is an unusual piece of writing. It's one of the few pieces of writing that survived from this time period, and the reason it survives is because someone took the time to write it on a piece of stone. This is not the original. This is a modern copy. No one is so foolish to leave the original lying out in the sun. Well, in the rain, because that would damage it. But it's a little poem. Someone has sat down and written a little sort of thing saying, in this month you plant, in this month you reap, in this month you do this, in this month you do that, and then they sign their name at the end of it, Abijah. And it's rather trivial. It doesn't really mean anything to anyone. But it's interesting that the person who writes this, they're not writing royal propaganda. It's not even clear that this person is a scribe. They're just sitting down and writing something for the fun of it, for the crack. And this would suggest that there is a relatively high degree of literacy in Israel. If people can sit down and just write random stuff like this. This is not the record of a transaction. This is not royal propaganda. It's just people sitting down and writing. So sometimes you'll hear skeptics talk about, the stuff like the Book of Ruth or whatever couldn't have been written around this time, that there wasn't high enough literacy. stuff like the Gezer Calendar gives an indication that there is a relatively high degree of literacy, even if the parchments and the papyrus have not actually survived to testify to that. So it's a very small artifact. I just thought I'd mention it in passing because I do find it interesting. Another interesting thing is, and you'll find this when you look at the Book of Kings, but if you look at the Book of Kings, you'll notice that the northern kingdom of Israel, which remember is the breakaway, it's the rebel kingdom, it's much more unstable than the southern kingdom of Judah. So the southern kingdom is it's ruled by the house of David, which has been sort of anointed by the prophets and so on. So here you can see Rehoboam and Jeroboam are both contemporaries. Jeroboam rebels against Rehoboam. Jehoshaphat and Ahab are both contemporaries as well. In fact, Jehoshaphat actually outlives Ahab. But for that time period, the kingdom of Judah has 4 kings, whereas the kingdom of Israel has 7 kings and 4 different dynasties. So this is a much, clearly the north is much more unstable than the south. And some people have talked about how they have kind of reversed, some scholars would say that the Bible is wrong and that Judah was the breakaway kingdom and not Israel. And I really think that the record of the kings shows that it's likely to be that the biblical the biblical narrative is much more likely to be correct. A rebel kingdom is much more likely to be unstable than a stable kingdom that has stuff break away from it. So here you can see this is a quotation from the Book of Kings. When the Israelites in the camp heard that Zimri had plotted against the king and murdered him, they proclaimed Omri, the commander of the army, king over Israel that very day there in the camp. Then Omri and all the Israelites with him withdrew from Gibbethon and laid siege to Tirzah, which at that point is the capital of Israel. When Zimri saw that the city was taken, he went into the citadel of the royal palace and set the palace on fire around him. So it gives you an idea of the fact that the northern kingdom, even though it's larger and more powerful, is kind of unstable. So just bear with me a second. Sorry. So this is just to kind of remind people, to give people some maps and so on. Around the year 830 BC, this is the kingdom of Judah down here, and this is the kingdom of Israel. And this is the same map, just with different stuff highlighted. These are the Phoenician city-states. This is the kingdom of Damascus, which is a major rival of the kingdom of Israel. These are the kingdoms of Ammon, Moab, and Edom. Okay. Now, one of the problems with this, I was talking about how the river civilizations had been weak. Ultimately, this period of weakness passes, and the river civilizations, particularly Assyria in northern Mesopotamia, they become strong again, and they start to interfere once more in the affairs in the lands between the river and Egypt. So I will read an inscription from one of the kings of Assyria. This gives you an idea of how easy it would have been to deal with these guys. These are not nice people. Aydah Narari, strong king, king of Assyria, king of the universe, the one who defeats his enemies in battle, the one who defeats his enemies, the king capable in battle, destroyer of cities. I scorch like the fire god, I overwhelm like the deluge. So this is an inscription of Aydah Narari II of Assyria. It's written probably around 893 BC, but it gives an idea of just how aggressive these guys were. These were just aggressive people. Sorry, 1 second. There's a slight problem with the presentation. So yeah, this is one of the Assyrian inscriptions here. And this is another inscription. This is by a later king called Ashur-nazir-pal. So this is him describing one of his expeditions. At that time, I made my way to the slopes of Mount Lebanon and went up to the great sea of the land of Muru. I cleansed my weapons in the Great Sea and made sacrifices to the gods. I received tribute from the kings of the seacoast, from the lands of the people of Tyre, Sidon, Byblos, Mahalatu, Maitu, Kaitu, Amuru, and the city of Arvad, which is on an island in the sea. And what this is describing is the Assyrians have actually passed the river. They have broken out across the Euphrates and are now pushing down towards Phoenicia. So the kingdoms in the region, even though kingdoms like Damascus and Israel hate each other, they begin to unite now against a common threat. So the palace of Ashur-Nazarpal can be seen in the Louvre. You'll see all sorts of disreputable characters there, I'm sure. So this gives you an idea of the Assyrian sort of civilization at this time. And this confrontation between the Assyrians, who are pushing now towards the west, and the kingdoms of Damascus and Hamath and Israel, who unite against them to stop them. This brings us to the first definitive point in history where we can say definitely a biblical character is mentioned in secular history. And this is the Battle of Kharkar in the year of 853. So this is an Assyrian inscription talking about the battle. An alliance had been formed of these 12 kings, and I'm only mentioning the first three. 1,200 chariots, 1,200 cavalry, and 20,000 troops of Hadadezer of Damascus. 700 chariots, 700 cavalry, and 10,000 troops of Yerhulini, the Hamathite. 2,000 chariots, 10,000 troops of Ahab the Israelite. So this is it's an Assyrian inscription, and it very definitely refers to Ahab, who is mentioned a lot in the Book of Kings and the Book of Chronicles. So this is it. This is basically the junction of biblical history and secular history. It's not a perfect junction because the Bible itself doesn't actually mention this battle, but the Bible very definitely mentions Ahab. The battle itself is kind of inconclusive. The Assyrians claim victory, but they kind of withdraw afterwards. The kingdoms of Damascus and Israel immediately go to war afterwards, and about a couple of years later, Ahab is actually killed by forces of Damascus. And yeah, so it's an inconclusive sort of thing, but this is kind of where history takes us at this point. So we've covered a lot of ground very quickly. Does anyone have any questions? Okay, so sorry, I'm glad that I've explained it so well. I'm going to just take a break from just talking about sort of history events as they happen. I'm going to try and talk a little bit more about history itself. So you remember I was talking about how stuff like David and Solomon don't show up in the historical record? I'd like to kind of backtrack and sort of give some context to that. So I'd like to talk about complaints and capitals. So the question I have for everyone is, what did Nani write to Nazir concerning the copper transaction about maybe 1750 BC? The answer is, I can tell you exactly what Nani wrote to Nazir about the particular copper transactions. Take cognizance that from now on, I will not accept here any copper from you that is not of the finest quality. I shall from now on select and take the ingots individually in my own yard, and I shall exercise against you my right of rejection because you have treated me with contempt. So this magnificent document here is the world's oldest customer complaint. It's quite fantastic. The person who's writing it, a person called Nani, who's a copper merchant in Babylon, is very annoyed about a copper trader further south who has sold him defective copper and cheated him a couple of times, and he's very angry, and he's writing this sort of letter to basically sort of say how he will not stand for this treatment, and he's very annoyed about it. And it's worth reading. If you're in the British Museum, you can see the artifact itself. If you Google it, it's the first customer complaint in history. This will come up. It's amusing enough reading in its own way. Customer complaints have not changed much in the last 37 centuries. So it's fascinating in a way that we can actually go and look back and see such levels of detail. We can know what these guys wrote to each other. Like, I wonder, like, I mean, could these people have ever imagined that 37 centuries later we'd be talking about them, that we would be mentioned their names, that this copper complaint about the defective copper would echo throughout history, and that for millennia, or well, I suppose how long our civilization lasts, but that for as long as history is taught, these names will will be remembered. It's an interesting one to think, and gives us an idea of just how much detail the history sometimes preserves to us. But I want to kind of show the other side of history. So let's have a look at New Kingdom Egypt. Now, as I was saying at the beginning of this, all of us have heard of Egypt, and when we think of Egypt, we tend to think of the New Kingdom. This is the temples of Abu Simbel, built by Ramses II. So we've all kind of heard of Egypt. Has anyone ever been to Egypt? I'm sure lots of people have. They've seen this sort of stuff. Uh, has anyone seen an Egyptian artifact in a museum? Even if you haven't, you're very familiar with Egyptian stuff from video games, from films, from music, from artwork. Like, we're very, very familiar with Egyptian culture. So do we know the enemies of Egypt, the rivals of Egypt over the course of the millennium? And we've mentioned a few of them in the course of this talk. The Hittites, the Assyrians, the Babylonians, all of these guys face off against the Egyptians at different points in history. But one that I'd kind of like to mention is a kingdom that I think probably most people won't be very familiar with. It's quite lesser. It's not well known, and that is Matani. Now you can see these guys here. These are Matani charioteers. One of them is the archer, the other is the driver. You can see a castle of the Matani in the distance. They have horses. They have a light-spoked chariot, and yeah, these guys were. They were a very powerful kingdom. I'm not sure who all has heard of the Matani on this call, but they're not really very familiar in the West, at least. Around the height of their power, around 1450 BC, they were the chief rival of Egypt, and this was Egypt at the height of its power, facing off against the Matani at the height of their power, and the two sides were actually quite well matched. The Matani are quite important to history. They possibly are the bringers of chariot warfare to the Middle East. So think of all the depictions of chariots. Think of the fact that the Israelites brought so many chariots to the Battle of Kharkar. The chariot is probably introduced by these guys, and possibly even the horse is introduced by these guys. They have some connections to Central Asia. They have some connections to Northern India as well. Their language is very, very interesting. But can anyone remember having seen a Matani artifact in a museum? Or even having heard of the Kingdom of Matani? And this was not an insignificant kingdom. So this actually shows the Kingdom of Matani here. So this sort of mustard yellow type thing. This is the Kingdom of the Kassites down below. This is the Kingdom of Egypt. This is the Kingdom of the Hittites up here. So in other words, the Kingdom of the Matani is powerful. This is one of the most powerful kingdoms on earth. And you can actually see the capitals that are marked in on the map. One of them is the Kassites. They don't trust the Babylonians, so they don't rule Babylon from Babylon. They rule it from a place called Dur-Kurigalzu around here. And we know where this is. There's a very large ziggurat there. And Hattusa is the capital of the Hittites. We know where this is. Brian Burns has actually been there, and I'm not jealous at all. But the capital of the Matani is a place called Washukani. Has anyone heard of Washukani? Even if people have heard of it, I'm guaranteeing no one knows where it is, because literally no one knows where it is. It's a lost city. We have a fair idea where it might be. We know that it's somewhere on the upper headwaters of the Kabur, but that's basically it. So we know what river it's on. We don't know where it is. We might be able to find it at some point in the future. There's a lot of sites that it might be. We just need to kind of dig them up. But of course, it's a very dangerous region of the world at the moment. It's not easy to go and organize a dig there. It's possible that ISIS have actually dug up the site and kind of ruined it archaeologically. So it's possible we'll actually never know where this is. But yeah, so we have to remember that around this was a powerful city. It was one of the most powerful cities in the world for about maybe 150 years. and it's lost. We just don't know where it is. So basically, I think it kind of it gives a little bit of context to when we're missing records of David and Solomon. I think the fact that we're missing the city of Washukani gives some context to that. I mean, there are huge gaps in history, like gaps you could drive a bus through. And unfortunately, we don't get to choose where those gaps are. It's just the nature of the evidence. We know that the Matani are powerful. We have their letters. We have the letters that other kings write to them. The Egyptian pharaohs are terrified of these guys. They send them solid gold statues. They marry each other's daughters and so on. Like, these guys are equal of the pharaohs. And yet their kingdom is, it might as well not have existed were it not for those letters. So imagine if we hadn't had those letters, we would never know that these guys even were a thing. So yeah, this is the map from earlier. You can see here this is the kingdom of the Matani being swallowed up by the Assyrians on one side and by the Hittites on the other. So by the end of the Bronze Age, they are pretty much swallowed up. So that's why I didn't speak about them earlier. But yeah, when they sort of were powerful in the Middle Bronze Age, they were powerful. And we know so very little about them. So I'd like us to just kind of finish up with sort of having had some knowledge of history, but also to remember the limitations of history, particularly in this time period. History will offer us glimpses of incredible detail, pinpoint accuracy of the ancient world in some places, but it also has vast empty spaces. And as I said, we don't get to pick and choose where these gaps are. And it's unfortunate that much of what we actually find interesting, like say David and Solomon, falls into those gaps. But with so much unknown, we really have to be very careful with our conclusions and to remember what history is and what it is not. So with that, I'd like to kind of round up and just kind of finish up. So if anyone has any questions, we still have a little bit of time. So if people want to go and throw out any questions.
David, I was wondering, are there any other kings of Israel or Judah mentioned in secular writings?
Yes, there are lots of later ones after Ahab. But prior to Ahab, Ahab is the first. Well, he is and he isn't. The Assyrians talk about Israel. They don't actually use the word for Israel. They talk about the land of Omri, which is the father of Ahab. So technically, Omri might be the first one, but he's not a contemporary. Ahab is the first one to be mentioned in a contemporary source. And a lot of the later kings are mentioned by name, but the earlier kings just aren't at that point.
How did they smelt iron? Did they know about coke at that point?
No, they weren't. They had to use charcoal. It had to be done with charcoal. So it's quite an intensive process in terms of deforestation. So a lot of the Near East is actually deforested as they figure out how to move into the Iron Age, and a lot of Europe as well when Europe moves into the Iron Age a couple hundred years later. They did know about iron beforehand. They actually seem to have got iron technology actually from meteorites. So there's actually iron in Tutankhamun's tomb, but it's from a meteorite. So that's obviously, it's pretty rare. You can't really do much of it. So iron actually starts out as a very high status metal. And then a couple people seem to figure out the trick of making it as a very luxury sort of artifact, but it's not really useful. It's quite soft. It's not well tempered. And it's quite expensive to make. It's only when they lose the ability to make bronze that they realize that this luxury ability has to be turned into kind of a workhorse.
So did the bronze completely disappear then when the iron came in?
No, it didn't. bronze doesn't degrade. Sorry, I'm probably a little out of my depth here because I'm not a chemist. But bronze doesn't degrade the same way iron does. So if you go to a museum and you see a bronze artifact, that's probably the original bronze. Like you can still like melt that down and it will still be bronze. Iron though will rust, so iron doesn't last, but bronze will. So the empires were probably able to kind of reuse their stuff for a few years, but then stuff would get lost, and they had to use iron to replace stuff, if that makes sense. But their old bronze tools would still work at least for some time, and they could reuse, melt it down, reuse it again. It was more to get
Okay,
new metal
thanks.
that they needed iron.
Okay, thanks.
No worries. Anything else from anyone? Okay. Well, if there's no other questions, might look at wrapping it up. Before we do sort of wrap it up, just to let people know that we'll be kind of there'll be another sort of talk same time tomorrow, 8 o'clock tomorrow evening, and we'll be kind of moving. I appreciate that today was kind of some unusual history, some stuff that would be kind of a little bit out of the normal. But for tomorrow, we'll be going from Ahab to basically the fall of Jerusalem in 586. So the topic, I think, will probably be a little more, people will be a little more sort of familiar with it. So hopefully it'll be a little bit easier as well. So yeah, that's it. So thank you and good night.
Well, thank you very much. You did really well, David. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you, David.
Thanks all.
Thanks, David.